Hello, and thank you for tuning in to our weekly review with me, Nassim Ahmed, and my regular guest, Mouin Rabbani. Hi, Mouin, how you doing?
Hello, Nassim. Always a pleasure.
Yeah, Mouin, I want to begin with last week's Israeli offensive, which killed over 600 Palestinians. Then we move on to revelations that Benjamin Netanyahu ordered indiscriminate bombing of Gaza way before, before just days after the 7th of October attack, showing, I guess, his genocidal intent, and also that there was no plan to strategically take out Hamas. That Netanyahu, from the outset, wanted to demolish and decimate Gaza. So I think it was a really fascinating revelation, which highlights the attack we've seen over the week regarding the cancer hospital. We want to cover that as well. And also the killing of Palestinian journalist Hossam Shabat, and also a number of other things we will discuss during our hour-long show. So I want to begin, more as I said, with the grim milestone of 50,000 Palestinians have been killed since 7 October, and um, and get your thoughts on the fact that, before we finished our last show last week, Israel had not broken the ceasefire and launched an offensive on Gaza. We've seen so much devastation over the past week. Haaretz itself had a title that this was the largest killing of Palestinian children ever in Israeli history. So I just want to get your thoughts on the destruction and the Israel's breaking the ceasefire over the past week, which happened just after we finished our show last week.
Yes, well, it's been clear, I think, since January, that Israel was not fulfilling the obligations that it had accepted pursuant to the terms of the January agreement, in various ways. And in fact, before Israel resumed its large-scale bombing of the Gaza Strip last week, it had already killed well over 100 Palestinians. I think an average of something like two a day. What's changed now is that Israel has resumed a full-scale offensive, meaning massive bombing of the Gaza Strip, renewed ground incursions, systematic destruction of property, and all the rest of it. So Israel has gone from violating the ceasefire in increasingly systematic ways to basically rendering it irrelevant, and acting as if no agreement exists. And I think it was the single highest daily toll of Palestinians killed since October 7th, perhaps even since 1967 in the Gaza Strip. Over 400 Palestinian dead in a single day, nearly half of them children, overwhelmingly civilian non-combatants. And what Israel's strategy now appears to be is not so much to target Hamas's military commanders or armed militants or weapons and so on, but to target its civilian and political officials, seeking to disrupt and destroy Hamas's ability to provide any form of administration in the Gaza Strip, to enforce any form of law and order within the Gaza Strip. In other words, it's a policy whose explicit purpose is to sow chaos and anarchy within the Gaza Strip for larger political objectives, which we'll be discussing later. I would just like to make one more comment. You correctly pointed out this article in Haaretz that describes this as the largest massacre of children. You won't find anything nearly similar in any Western press outlet, even on the liberal end of the spectrum. I mean, it's almost as if at the height of the Second World War, you could get more accurate information about what the Nazis are doing from the German press than from the British or American press. It's really, it boggles the mind, the degree of media complicity and collusion with Israel during this genocide, which is, of course, a key enabling factor. And I will get into the specifics of what Israel has been doing and how it has been able to do it later in this discussion, I presume.
And you're right to point that out, and you're not alone in being shocked at the lack of coverage on the level of devastation. The same thing with the Palestinian journalist in Gaza that has been killed. There's been barely any mention of him. We'll speak about the journalist later on, but there's been barely any mention of him on Western press as well. And over the week, I mean, following the news coming from Israel, you get a sense of the motivation right from the outset and the manner in which Israel has been conducting its operations in Gaza. One of the I would say one of the most important articles that just came out last week from an Israeli source is that Benjamin Netanyahu reprimanded his officials angrily, saying, why have you only targeted 1,500 targets in Gaza? So they came to him, Israeli generals said, we've targeted 1,500 targets in Gaza. And Netanyahu was very angry and he said, why have you just targeted 1,500? Why not 5,000? And he went on to say that, we don't have 5,000 targets. And Netanyahu said, I don't care. Just destroy everything. Destroy all the homes. Destroy everything. And I don't think you'll get a clear picture than this of the motivations Netanyahu and Israeli officials had from the outset, that their intent right from the outset was to annihilate Gaza. And this article in Israel clearly exposes this motivation.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, of course, Israel wanted to annihilate Hamas. Of course, it wanted to eradicate all the Palestinian armed groups in the Gaza Strip. And of course, it wanted to retrieve its captives from the Gaza Strip. But to pretend that this is therefore a war between Israel and Hamas, or that this was Israel's primary or sole objective, rather than recognizing reality that this was a genocidal Israeli military campaign directed at the Palestinian people as such, with clear intent. Not to recognize that is hiding the sun with your pinky. It's so obvious. One doesn't actually need this article, valuable as it may be, to understand what's going on. I mean, there are enough statements over the course of the past year and a half. We have all the images of unprecedented, systematic, deliberate destruction. As far as Netanyahu himself is concerned, he has a record of making such statements. For example, in 1989, during the Tiananmen the suppression of the Tiananmen protests in China, in the Chinese capital, Beijing. He was an advocate of using the intense global focus on China at the height of the first Intifada as a pretext to consider the mass deportation of Palestinians from the occupied territories. I think he made similar suggestions at the time of the 1991 Kuwait crisis. And in fact, one of his biographers, or rather, I can't remember the name, a British journalist who was writing a biography of him or one of his relatives, recalls Netanyahu making very similar statements around the kitchen table in the early 1980s. So there's nothing new here. And of course, annexing territory and dispossessing the people who live in that territory is in the very DNA of Zionism from its outset, and has been evident in its practice for a century. So, but yet we act to such reports with surprise, and then the Hasbara Symphony Orchestra and Israel's apologists and flunkies respond with this combination that's quite bizarre of, on the one hand, denial and on the other, celebration. But we also need to ask ourselves why this is happening. I mean, we've now reached the stage where Israel no longer denies targeting journalists, but claims it is justified in doing so. It no longer denies it is bombing and destroying hospitals, but claims that it is justified in doing so. It no longer denies that it's murdering children by the bushel, but claims that it is right to do so. Just this week, it shelled the headquarters of the International Committee of the Red Cross. And of course, it murdered two more journalists, Hussam Shubat and Mohammed Mansour. Why is it doing these things? The very simple answer is because it can, because it knows it can, because its sponsors and allies in Washington, London, and Brussels have allowed Israel to normalize such conduct, have made explicitly clear to Israel that it can do as it pleases, and that there will not and cannot be consequences, that Israel's sponsors and allies in Washington and London and Brussels will ensure that the arms will keep flowing, will give it all the political cover that it requires to conduct this genocide, and will ensure that the legal instruments and international institutions that were explicitly established to hold such conduct to account will not be able to fulfill their role. Just this week, as you mentioned earlier, we had probably the single bloodiest day in the Gaza Strip since 1967. How did the European Union respond? Well, it sent its chief foreign policy official, Kaya Kallas, to Israel to stand alongside an indicted war criminal, Benjamin Netanyahu, the international fugitive from justice, to extol the closeness of European-Israeli relations and to pledge more of the same. So, it's impossible not to look at this reality and not conclude that there is a collective decision that was made in Washington, London, and Brussels that predates Trump by well over a year, that Israel will be permitted to do as it pleases, that no volume of Palestinian blood, no volume of destruction of Palestinian property will be too high for these sponsors and allies, and that they will do anything and everything within their power to ensure that Israel is given the means to continue and complete this genocide, and just as importantly, to face absolutely no consequences and have absolutely no accountability for doing so, because Israeli impunity has become a central plank of Western foreign policy.
And it's precisely because of the reasons you mentioned that the cancer hospital was bombed last week. And you mentioned the Gaza journalist, Hussam Shubat, who was killed, murdered yesterday. So I wanted to just read, though, his last message. And I think he deserves at least this for us to remember him and commemorate him, and also read out his last message. So he said, and I'll read, if you're reading this, it means I have been killed, most likely targeted by the Israeli occupation forces. Shabazz message read. He goes on to detail how his colleagues, his life and dreams were shattered by the war, and explains his decision to document Israel's war as he slept on the streets and endured hunger and Israeli shelling. And he says, by God, I fulfilled my duty as a journalist. I risked everything to report the truth, and now I am finally at rest, something I haven't known in the past 18 months. I did all this because I believe in the Palestinian cause. I believe this land is ours, and it has been the highest honor of my life to die defending it and serving its people. So here is this young journalist murdered by the Israelis, and then you have Western media completely ignoring this big story, and Israeli flankiers justifying this. We've come to a situation where, if Israel kills a journalist, he can't have been a journalist. He must have been Hamas fighter. You don't need any proof, no evidence. If Israel kills a journalist, he must have been. That is the logic we've descended
Yes,
into.
because Israel would never target a civilian non-combatant. I mean, the only person who has been killed in the Gaza Strip since October 7th was Yahya Sinwar. No one else has been killed. It's absolutely absurd, and this extraordinarily courageous young man, Hussam Shubat, may he rest in eternal peace, was actually killed only hours after reporting on the assassination of his journalistic colleague, Mahmoud Mansour. I think it was Muhammad Mansour. But let's understand, Israel, yes, Israel pulled the trigger. Israel is directly responsible for their murder, for their targeted assassination. But Israel is not solely responsible. That organization in the United Kingdom and Great Britain, which claims to be concerned with journalism and journalistic integrity and journalistic values, which revoked an award it had given journalists in Gaza for their role during the past year. That organization is directly complicit in putting a target on these two journalists' back. The Western media that have remained absolutely silent and looked the other way, as hundreds of their Palestinian colleagues, journalists, have been slaughtered, often deliberately targeted by Israel. They are directly complicit in the murder of Hussam Shubat and Muhammad Mansour and all the others. Their absolute silence over the course of a year and a half about these kinds of incidents makes them directly complicit. These organizations, BBC, CNN, New York Times, and the rest of them, all they have to do is inform the Israeli government that unless and until their reporters are given direct access to the Gaza Strip, they will no longer interview Israeli government officials. They will no longer report on official Israeli statements. If they were to do that, it would take literally 5 minutes for the Israeli government to cave and allow these media organizations free access to the Gaza Strip and to report on things. But since they're all cowards and stenographers for Israel, they, on the one hand, rely on professional Palestinian journalists for much of the reporting from the Gaza Strip, when they're not just copy pasting Israeli statements, and then say absolutely nothing when they're murdered. So we can and should point the finger directly at Israel for its murders, for its genocide, and so on. But there is a enabling environment. There is a whole ecosystem of media, of politicians, of governments that is making all of this possible and is determined to continue making it possible, even as many analysts are warning that we are now approaching the most intensive phase of this genocidal military campaign.
And we should mention Hussam is one of 208 media personnel and journalists that have
Indeed.
been murdered over the past 16 months. And you spoke about the enabling environment that has been created for Israel to carry out its onslaught on Gaza. And I can't but help think of that when we speak about the destruction of the specialized cancer hospital over the past week. That was seen as a deliberate, direct attack at the hospital, one of many hospitals now that have been decimated and destroyed. And when I saw that, I mean, again, going back to the issue about enabling an environment, how the Western governments and press responded to the bombing of Al-Ahli Baptist Hospital on October 17, 2003, killing 205 to 500 Palestinians. Most Western governments said that it wasn't Israel, it was Hamas misfire, and they gave all kinds of justifications. And I think this was the moment when Israel realized, nah, they've
Absolutely.
what they have they can do whatever they want and they can get away with this. And this was the beginning of the impunity, this level
Absolutely.
of impunity which we've never seen before. And this is the beginning of the destruction of all the hospitals, including the one that was destroyed last week, the specialized cancer hospital. So I just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Well, look how far Israel has come. It was in, I can't recall, perhaps November of 2023 when they bombed Al Ahli Baptist Hospital in Gaza City, um, which, in contrast to other hospitals, has a direct link with the Anglican Church. And as several analysts have pointed out, it wasn't targeted despite its links with the Anglican Church, but because of those links, to test whether or not they could get away with it. They put forward claims that, in fact, it was a misfired Palestinian rocket that, caused destruction more powerful than every other Palestinian rocket fired since 2000 BC put together, and their version was accepted. Then they moved on to the largest and most important medical complex in the Gaza Strip, Al Shifa Hospital, and put out these cartoons of a Hamas Pentagon under the hospital, and you got these long articles in the New York Times and BBC website and so on, explaining how Hamas basically can't function without its headquarters in Al Shifa Hospital. And lo and behold, they invaded Al Shifa, destroyed it, left children, infants on life support to rot and so on, and they got away with it. So fast forward to March 2025. Um, Israeli forces, which had been stationed within this hospital, the only cancer hospital in the Gaza Strip, Israeli forces, which had been stationed there for over a year, and therefore could not possibly put forward any type of claim that it was a Hamas facility, simply went in and systematically blew it up. What's the difference? This time they didn't even bother to justify their conduct, and their conduct barely registered in the Western media. In other words, we have now reached the stage where Israel justifiably has the full confidence that it can blow up cancer hospitals and no one will even bat an eyelid, or at least none of its sponsors and allies in the West will even bat an eyelid, because they think their only concern with such conduct is that Israel can do so with impunity and suffer no consequences for it. And they will destroy anyone who gets in the way. Look at what's happening in the United States now.
And you mentioned that Israeli soldiers were based there, despite that propagandist came out on social media and
Yes, it
said
was an
that
Israeli
it
military
was,
base for an entire
but they
year.
said it was a Hamas facility, despite the fact that
Exactly.
it was an Israeli military base for over a year now. Um, and if you're watching this from through the lens and the eyes of the Western media, you'd think Israelis are united, they're all behind Benjamin Netanyahu. You wouldn't realize the chaos that's unfolding in Israel. The former ex-Supreme Court chief, Aaron Barak, he said Israel is headed to civil war. And you wouldn't know that if you were watching this from, as I said, from CNN, from BBC, and others, and and of course we know Israel is in the midst of a crisis domestically, and I just want to get your thoughts on what's happening in Israel specifically. Many had, suspected analysts that, like ourselves, I would say, that the ceasefire was just temporary. Ultimately, Netanyahu wants to get back to war because that's the only way he can survive. His political survival was always the number one priority. And we saw how, soon as he broke the ceasefire and launched the war against Gaza, Ben-Gvir, who had left the coalition government, returned to government. So now he has this messianic government back together again. But Israeli society are deeply fractured. And Harrods this week, I mean, just today, published a news piece, article actually, saying that by the end of this week, Israel will not be the same Israel anymore because of the changes that are taking place domestically and the attack on the judiciary by the current government.
Well, yes, of course, Netanyahu is deeply invested in his political survival. And of course, the Israeli government is deeply invested in the survival of the ruling coalition. But that's not why this is all happening. Those are important contributory factors. But what we've been witnessing in the Gaza Strip is not an entire nation, an entire state, an entire military leadership, an entire political coalition being dragged into a genocidal military campaign to save the skin of one man. No, this is a national Israeli project. This is a campaign in which the entire Israeli establishment and political and military leadership are complicit. They are knowingly and willingly doing this for their own reasons because they believe it is an important strategic priority. I refuse to believe that the entire Israeli military and political leadership and so on has been conducting itself this way for 18 months solely to keep one person in power in the prime minister's office. It just doesn't make sense. But getting back to your question, basically what is happening is that Netanyahu and his associates have sufficient confidence that they can return to the authoritarian legislative agenda that they were seeking to implement before October 2023. So they've now fired the head of the domestic intelligence agency, Shin Bet, Ronan Bar. They're seeking to fire the attorney general. They're conducting various other reforms that collectively will transform the Israeli prime minister into a kind of Zionist emperor. And this more than more than the slaughter of thousands of children, more than genocide, is causing deep fissures in Israeli society and intensifying the polarization within Israeli society. And it is in that context that you're seeing these warnings from Aaron Barak, who was perfectly happy to be Israel's nominee at the International Court of Justice and cover for its genocide in the ICJ case, and is deeply implicated in the occupation as a former president of the Israel Supreme Court. He is now warning of civil war within Israel, meaning a conflict between different factions of Israeli Jewish society. And now you have the former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert and others making similar warnings. Is this just hysteria, or is there a real basis to these warnings? Well, I think that will depend on how determinedly not only Netanyahu, but also his closest associates, the fascist right, will seek to bulldoze their agenda and overturn kind of the standards and traditions on which Israeli politics has been based during the short life of the Israeli state.
Yeah, let's turn our attention to some of the other wider issues. And one thing I wanted to get your thoughts on is, I would say, the U-turn within the Trump administration. I remember before January 19 ceasefire was negotiated, Steve Witkoff, who is the Middle East envoy for President Donald Trump, he seemed quite bullish when he apparently, his reporters told the Israelis, Trump wants a ceasefire. He's going to get a ceasefire. He insisted on a ceasefire, and managed to get that before Trump's inauguration in January 20. And now he has given two interviews, one with Tucker Carlson, the right-wing American commentator, podcast host, and also I think was another interview in Fox News, where he went on TV and he said that he was duped by Hamas, and the current escalation is entirely the fault of Hamas, and Hamas is responsible for the collapse of the ceasefire negotiation. And I'm wondering whether he's seen what's happened to Adam Boehler, the person who was hostage negotiator on behalf of Trump. And we remember he went on, I think, CNN, and he said that, look, Hamas is a creature with two horns, meaning it's not a devil. They're actually good guys. And he was conducting negotiations with Hamas. Secretly, apparently. So he's been marginalized, Adam Boehler, and I think Steve Woodcock probably has seen that, and now he seems to be reading entirely from the Israeli script because his career is probably in danger. I mean, is that how you see it? Because he was at one point quite bullish. Now he's coming out and saying he was duped by Hamas and it's entirely Hamas's fault and there's no blame on the Israeli side.
Yes, politicians will typically choose the path of least resistance. And on this point, I do think that I was wrong and need to correct myself, because previously what I've said about Adam Boehler is that he is the hostage envoy. He has a much more restricted mandate than Witkoff. And so therefore, his absence from the scene should be seen as no more than his fulfillment of his role and departure once it has been fulfilled, and that it should not be seen as punishment for him making the absolutely outrageous and unspeakably anti-Semitic statement that the United States is not an agent of Israel. But with hindsight, I think I do need to correct my previous view, which is that Boehler does appear to have been successfully sidelined by Israel and its Amen corner in Washington for this unspeakably anti-Semitic statement that he made about the U.S. Not being an agent of Israel, and that Witkoff, despite his closeness to Trump, does appear to have received the memo and has gotten with the program, which is to prioritize Israeli interests. And, it was Witkoff, after all, who compelled Israel to accept the January agreement. It was Witkoff who then appeared to give Israel a get out of jail free card by putting forward a bridging proposal. And when Hamas insisted on sticking with the agreement that had already been agreed, rather than transitioning to an entirely new and different one, Witkoff basically decided to, much like Blinken and Biden before him, blame Hamas for Israel's renewal of its genocidal military campaign, claimed that it was Hamas, which had accepted the agreement, which had not accepted it, and to claim that Israel, which rejected the agreement, as the one that was being flexible, and all the rest of it. So nothing new under the sun here. It's unfortunate, of course, that Witkoff has decided to play the role of Israeli agent. But at the end of the day, let's not put horns on the Trump administration either. Let's also look for not only changes and radical departures, but continuity. And what we see is that the U.S. administration now is acting almost exactly as its predecessor, the Biden administration, rather than somehow transforming U.S. policy. At the same time, it's also possible that Witkoff is not acting so much out of any ideological commitments, but that he also wants to succeed. and that he has determined that bowing to Israeli demands and allowing Israel to have its way in the Gaza Strip is the shortest path to success, and that once it emerges that Israel is not going to succeed, where it has failed for a year and a half, that he may feel that the United States has basically two choices: either to once again force Israel to implement what it has already accepted, or an expanded regional war. And on this score, it's also interesting that in this leaked signals group about, in which one of Israel's chief stenographers, Jeff Goldberg, the Atlantic editor, was included, all the press attention is focusing on how hostile this group was towards Europe. But what's less noted is that it is also they are also saying that if we restore maritime shipping in the Red Sea, it's also doing a real service to Egypt, and Egypt will basically have to reciprocate what we're doing for it. And I think this is an allusion to the Trump Riviera plan. So, if these people still have the illusion that helping the Egyptian treasury with a few $1 billion is going to open the border between Gaza and Sinai, and the forced displacement of 2 million Palestinians to Egypt, they're in for a surprise, I believe.
I remember Trump famously said that he'll build a wall and Mexico will pay for it. I think that's his logic
Yes.
going into any
Sounds good on television.
Yeah, but I think he probably thinks that he can do the same with the what's happening in Gaza. Yes, he will push through with the Riviera plan, but it's the Arabs who will pay for it. He will police the Red Sea, but it's the Arabs and others that will pay for it. Whether that turns out to be true or not, we'll wait and see. But on the Riviera plan, Israel seems to be pushing ahead, and in terms domestically at least, it's set up or it's approved a government bureau for the voluntary immigration of Palestinians from Gaza. That's the bureau that's been approved by the Israeli government. And when I saw that and read about it, and you couldn't but see the irony that that's lost on Israel. It was the Nazis themselves who set up a central office for Jewish immigration, voluntary immigration from Germany to other parts of the world to expedite what they would call a voluntary transfer of Jews from Germany. And I thought, do they not read history? Do they not? Are they not aware of their own history about how
maybe they are?
Yes, it was such an amazing ironic development that Israel is setting up this bureau called Voluntary Transfer of Palestinians from Gaza, knowing full well it was the Nazis themselves who set up such an institution for the voluntary transfer of Jews from Germany. And it's such a shocking
Why
development.
assume they're unaware of that?
Yeah, maybe they are sending a message. Maybe they are sending a message. I don't know. Politically, intellectually, ideologically, there are similarities, many would say.
Well,
Yeah.
I guess sorry, did I interrupt you?
No. Carry on.
I was going to say, I mean, really the only point I would make about this is the one that was, I think, perceptively made by Chris Doyle of the Council for the Advancement of Arab-British Understanding, in which he pointed out that if you're giving people a choice between departure and genocide, between departure and famine, that's not voluntary emigration. That's appropriately called ethnic cleansing. I think that says it all.
Yeah. Okay, let's turn to, again, sticking with the Arrow plan for post-genocide Gaza. There's reports that the UAE is lobbying the Trump administration to reject the Arab plan. I mean, what do you think is happening here? I mean, maybe the Trump administration is trying to undermine the Arab plan for post-genocide Gaza, and they're using the UAE to wreck the plan. I mean, what do you think is happening?
Well, I think the broader context is that these Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Qatar, states with massive resources, understand that U.S. foreign policy is for sale, and they're essentially engaged in a bidding war in which the highest bidder will have an important role in formulating U.S. Middle East policy. I mean, the difference here is that the Palestinians don't have an overwhelming bipartisan majority in Congress. Israel does. The Gulf states, they have sympathetic senators and some who will do their bidding, but not nearly on the scale of Israel, whose agents in Congress, even when they are recipients of money from APAC and so on, um, tend tend to do Israel's bidding on a voluntary basis and out of conviction rather than out of fear and intimidation, in my view. But these Gulf states understand U.S. foreign policy is for sale, and they're engaged in a bidding war to buy it. And in this particular case, the United Arab Emirates is apparently dissatisfied with the Arab plan because it doesn't explicitly call for the destruction of Hamas, and they're also, trying to demonstrate that they consider Trump's Riviera plan the only viable alternative. So they have announced that they plan to invest, I think, $1.4 trillion or something like that, more money than they'll ever have in the United States in order to seek to influence the U.S. response to an Arab League plan that they endorsed, but which they don't want to see implemented. I mean, it's a lot of smoke and mirrors, really, more than anything else here going on.
I wanted to speak about something that happened just yesterday, and that's the detention and attack on the Oscar-winning producer from the West Bank, um, Hamdan Balal. He was part of the producing team that won no prize for No Other Land 4 weeks ago. I think in the Oscars, it won the award for the best documentary. And if anyone hasn't seen it, they should watch that documentary. It's an amazing documentary. And it goes back to, I think, something you were talking about earlier, just the theme of Israel's impunity, that they can do whatever they want and no one's going to say anything about it. First of all, this news has not been covered by the mainstream. This is someone who was at the Oscars 4 weeks ago receiving his prize, and Israel is saying, look, you can go to the Oscars, but we will, at the end of the day, we can do whatever we want, whenever we want, and anything we want to you, and there's nothing you can do about it. And this is a theme that was again expressed in the leaflets that was dropped on Gaza few weeks ago in February, where the Israelis dropped the leaflets, and it said that the world will not change. People will not care about you in Gaza. No one will feel for you. No one will ask about you. You have been left alone, and to face the inevitable fate which you find yourself in. So that's the kind of message they're giving to Palestinians in Gaza. And I think a lot of what we're discussing is consistent. And I think the same theme with the arrest and the attack on the producer Hamdan Balal. Just want to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah. I mean, it's of a piece with everything else what we've been discussing. Um, Israel sees international media assisting it in putting targets on the backs of Palestinian journalists and then kills them because it knows it can. Israel bombs an ICRC headquarters in Rafah, I think knowing that there was no one inside at the moment, just to see what the reaction can be. And lo and behold, the statement in response by the ICRC doesn't even mention Israel as a perpetrator. So now it knows that next time it can bomb an ICRC building that's full of Palestinians, and there won't be any price to pay. Israel Sorry, I forgot what the other point I was going to make. Oh,
Well,
Israel kills this time international UN staff in the Gaza Strip. And how does the UN Secretariat respond? By reducing what it calls the UN footprint in the Gaza Strip. So on the one hand, it knows that criminal conduct pays and produces results. And it also knows, just as importantly, that it will be protected and defended in doing so, not only by its sponsors and allies, but even by the victims of its criminal conduct. And what we're seeing now is of a piece. I mean, this Palestinian Oscar winner was brutally assaulted by settlers who were not vigilantes, but are auxiliaries of the Israeli state. And how did the Israeli army respond? Not by arresting the perpetrators, but by arresting him. Will now the those who gave him this award utter even a peep in protest at what's happened? I suspect not, but we'll find out. But once again, it's the old saying, why did you do this? Well, because I knew I could, because you can. And that's pretty much the Israeli attitude. They don't just go and kick the door in. They push a little, wait for the response. If the response allows them to push further, they push further. And what they've discovered the past 18 months is that there will be absolutely no restraint placed on any Israeli conduct, no matter how genocidal, no matter how outrageous, no matter how criminal.
before I came here, I did look to see if Oscars had issued a statement or something. I mean, you'd expect someone who has won your award and was a guest at your awards, you'd come
I
to
wouldn't.
protect him. But of course, we expect that, but they
If
haven't.
he'd made
So,
a movie about the Holocaust, yes, I would agree.
hmm. So let's end with some the latest development at US campuses. I want to finish with this. We're seeing more and more how campuses are caving. Columbia is the latest. Trump sent a letter to Columbia University with a list of demands to reinstate the 400 million that was stripped off Columbia in funding, and Columbia seems to have caved. One of the demands was to endorse the IHRA, International Holocaust Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, which in its examples, 7 of the 11 examples, conflates criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism. So even its drafter has warned against the adoption of the IHRA in such a manner because it chills and cracks down on free speech. But Columbia University has endorsed that, amongst many other things. And I wrote a piece last week just explaining how in the eyes of Israel, the front line is not just the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. The front line is New York, is London, is Berlin, is
Yes.
Columbia University. That's the front line. That's the battleground, and they are, in a sense, deploying or employing the repressive instruments of states and governments in the West to crack down on their own citizens. That's the battle that's taking place at the moment,
Yeah.
which seems to be, and Colombia seems to be a classic example of that. So I want to get your thoughts
Yes.
on the latest development in Colombia, because I know you had a few things to say as well.
Yeah. Well, this idea that you can kind of support this brutal repression abroad, and that it's not going to boomerang and reflect itself within your own society. Well, we just spoke about Netanyahu's authoritarian agenda. That's one example. And what's happening in the United States now is another example. Adam Schatz had an absolutely brilliant piece in the London Review of Books blog post entitled Submission, in which he not only explains exactly what's going on and why it's happening, and he's referring both to Columbia and to these liberal law firms who are now bending the knee in front of Trump. But he also makes, I think, the absolutely crucial observation um, that these university administrations and boards of trustees are not being beaten into submission, but that they are colluding and collaborating more than they're being forced to, because they've been on board with this agenda of crushing student protest against Israeli genocide and delegitimizing any opposition to genocide as anti-Semitism and terrorism and all the rest of it. They've been on board with this since the Biden administration. And today, this morning, I was reading that there's now apparently a lawsuit against Students for Justice, the Columbia chapter of Students for Justice in Palestine, and some of its leaders making the absolutely absurd claim that these individuals and this group had advanced knowledge of the October 7th attacks and should therefore be held somehow responsible. We're really in Alice in Wonderland territory here, but the consequences are not a fairy tale, but a horror story.
Thanks, Mouin. We'll return again with the latest from next week in our roundup, I think Monday as well, Tuesday. I want to thank you for joining us and thank you for tuning in for our weekly review with me, Naseem Ahmed, and my guest, Mouin Rabbani. Bye-bye.